I mean, we just had Russia launch this massive missile, which shows just incredible military advancement at the same time that Russia is undergoing or the target of one of the biggest economic wars of this last generation with tens of thousands of sanctions, over 16,000. Comment on how this economic war is going and how it relates to this overall situation that the United States and NATO finds itself in.
Well, as usual, there's a blizzard of conflicting and alternative analyses made even more crazy by the fact that we really don't know very much about this new missile. We have Mr. Putin's description of it. We have some other bits and pieces. We don't even have a clear sense of how much damage it did. There's some question about whether it's altogether new or whether it's the adaptation of a submarine-based missile system. So commenting on exactly what its significance is probably a mistake at this point, which is not to take a position one way or the other, but to recognize we're going to have to wait a bit more to know enough to do that. What I can do, and what is perhaps equally interesting, is to put it in the context of what the sanctions were supposed to do to Russia versus what they have done. There, it's crystal clear that the collective West, that is the United States and basically the G7, that's the United States plus its allies, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, made colossal misjudgments and miscalculations in going into this war, both in terms of what they thought Ukraine could and would do, and in terms of what they thought the Russians could and would do. Let me just enumerate two or three of the big ones. Shortly after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, President Biden and the highest officials around him explained that this war would weaken Russia. Phrases like bring Russia to its knees and the ruble will collapse were repeated for weeks on end, as if it were a foregone conclusion, because they had all decided that was what would happen. The Ukrainian army would outmaneuver what was believed to be a sclerotic, old, out of shape, ill-equipped Russian military. And that when that didn't kind of work out, and you had the big sanctions program, which was going to then cripple Russia by closing the world to its exports of oil and gas. And remember, the American joke about Russia at the time was that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. Well, all of that was wrong. The ruble didn't collapse. Russia didn't fall to its knees. None of it. Russian exports of oil and gas have done just fine. Indeed, the export of oil and gas has often gone above what it was before the war, has generated enormous revenues because the Chinese and the Indians, among others, bought this oil and gas, as they continue to do, thereby providing Russia with the revenue it needed to pursue the war. And then its military demonstrated extraordinary adaptability, modernization, culminating in this remarkable hypersonic missile, whatever it actually turns out to be. Their military is in very good shape, far better than what was assumed, far better than what we were assured. I remember a speech of Lloyd Austin, the Minister of Defense in the United States, telling us about how this war would weaken Russia and so on. In the year 2024 that we're in, The International Monetary Fund says that economic growth in the United States this year will be 2.8% of GDP. In Russia, it will be more than that. In China, 4.8%. In India, 7%. Russia, China, and India, who have now come together to support Russia, each of them is doing better than the United States that is funding Ukraine. And of course, the worst of all are the people of Ukraine on whose soil most of this war has been fought, and the devastation there, and the departure of millions and millions of their citizens. It'll take them a long, long time to recover, if ever they can. So what I'm saying to you is that the war against Russia, this proxy war, pursued by the United States, Britain, and the G7, some more, some less, is an enormous, costly failure. It's $200 to $300 billion at least down the drain. And Americans and Europeans will long discuss and rue the day they made a decision to lay out that amount of money, not on all their domestic needs. And let me remind you, the Europeans, for them, a 2.8% rate of growth this year would be nirvana. Germany is in recession. Britain is a close second. These are economic basket cases whose situation was made worse when they couldn't access cheap Russian oil and gas, which had been one of the key components of the so-called economic miracle that Western Europe used to boast about. They are in horrible trouble, having wasted an enormous amount of money. And so the damage that has been done is to Ukraine and Europe, secondarily the United States, but not to the ostensible enemies. If there were a different kind of government in the United States, more like in certain European countries, you would have had mass resignations of leading officials for having blundered so badly in this affair. But of course, we don't do that. We can't do that because we're desperately trying to hold on in the United States to what is now clearly the illusion of being the once powerful U.S. when we aren't anymore. Let's be honest here. We lost the war in Vietnam. We lost the war in Afghanistan. We lost the war in Iraq. We're losing the war in Ukraine. Hello, there's something going on here, isn't there? Right? The people who run Vietnam is the Communist Party of Vietnam. The people who run Afghanistan are the Taliban. Those were the enemies of the United States. But they are the dominant political forces in those, and I could go on. So we are looking at, in my judgment, beyond all the specifics that Michael and I talk about, we are watching the decline of an empire and the accumulated difficulties of U.S. capitalism play themselves out in one symptom after another. Let me give you just one more example that jumped out at me today. Last night, apparently, President-elect Trump announced, as if he were already the president, the tariffs he's going to hit Mexico and Canada, which turn out to be larger than the ones he was going to do on China, which is funny because it was literally only a matter of weeks ago that we got the reverse kind of story, that China would be the great target and almost no mention of Mexico and Canada. And one of the reasons, the main reason the president gave is he's going to stop immigration. And there was, again, the usual language about invasion. Well, if you put a 25% tariff Let me just do a very simple economic lesson. You put a 25% tariff on Mexico, it means all of that product that Mexico produces and ships to the US will now cost suddenly 25% more because every importer of Mexican goods will have to give a 25% tax, that's what a tariff is, to Uncle Sam. It'll be American importers paying tax to the American government. Now, there's two things you want to think about here. Number one, the Republican Party used to be thought of as the party against taxes, but it isn't. In its new incarnation, it is a massively taxing entity. That's what it's doing. Tariff is a kind of tax. It doesn't stop being a tax because you call it a tariff. That's silly. But here's the part I like even more, just for the irony. If you do that, Mexicans will be able to sell much less produce in the US because it's more expensive. So they won't be able to sell. So they'll lay off workers. Well, if you lay off a worker in Mexico, you're confronting that worker with two choices. You can quietly go home, lie down, and die. That's your one shot. Here's your second shot. Collect your family and try to migrate to the United States to get a job. This program will worsen the immigration it is ostensibly supposed to stop. And that incoherence, that's the single most impressive quality, not just of Mr. Trump, but of Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary. What's coming out of their mouths is more of this advertising junk that may be good for a campaign, but does not work as a policy.
We just saw Russia launch the Oreshnik missile, which has the capability of hitting anywhere really in the world, in particular Europe, in a matter of minutes without nuclear fallout. And this has driven NATO crazy. But we've talked about a lot also the economic implications of this conflict. And I'm just going to play now what Lindsey Graham had to say, because I think it is very instructive for what this is really all about for the United States and NATO. And I'd like your comment to help us understand this.
Ukraine is still standing. This war is about money. People don't talk much about it. But you know, the richest country in all of Europe for rare earth minerals is Ukraine. $2 to $7 trillion worth of minerals that are rare earth minerals, very relevant to the 21st century. Ukraine's ready to do a deal with us, not the Russians. So it's in our interest to make sure that Russia doesn't take over the place. It's the breadbasket of really the developing world. 50% of all the food going to Africa comes out of Ukraine. We can make money and have an economic relationship with Ukraine that'd be very beneficial to us with peace. So Donald Trump's going to do a deal to get our money back, to enrich ourselves with rare earth minerals, a good deal for Ukraine and us, and he's going to bring peace. And Biden's been a disaster when it comes to containing bad guys.
So, Richard, I'll start with you. How is this war going for, especially economically, for the United States and NATO, given what Lindsey Graham was just saying?
Well, let me begin by saying that Lindsey Graham is an embarrassment to all of us. When he opens his mouth about economics, all of us, and I'm talking about my colleagues on the right, on the left, and in the middle, get ready for something which, if an undergraduate said it in one of our classrooms, we'd shake our head in disbelief at how poorly we had been able to teach that young man or woman what we're there to do. It's extraordinary, really extraordinary. The issues in the Ukraine war, as made clear by the Russians over and over again, and not disputed really by anybody except, of course, Lindsey Graham, the issue is that the Russians feel their security is threatened by having a NATO member in Ukraine on their border. They feel as though they have let a lot of that kind of thing go, as many of the countries of Eastern Europe have already joined NATO. Ukraine is the biggest among them, and if you look at the geography, pokes into Russia quite extensively. They didn't want that. And they insisted that Ukraine could be an independent country, could have a government hostile to Russia, could do all kinds of things. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but not be part of NATO and not be allow missiles that threaten Russia to be located on its territory. Here's one of the things they never asked for and do not ask for now: to control with whom an independent Ukraine would make financial deals. The Ukraine produces a lot of food products. Russia understands that those are marketed by Ukraine around the world, and that generates income for Ukraine and is a crucial part of its economy. And Russia has no need for and no interest in doing much about that, or certainly not in ending it. And the same would be true if Ukraine has minerals and so forth. Maybe what Mr. Lindsey Graham means, because he's not too clear in his own head about these things, which is obvious, maybe what he means is that the money that the United States is going to be asked to contribute to Ukraine when the war is over, to help rebuild the enormous parts of Ukraine that have been damaged in the war, maybe what he means is that money going to Ukraine will immediately be turned around and sent right back to the United States in the form of rare earths that the United States needs. It wants those things. That's nice. Normally, it would have to go and bid for them the way everybody normally does in international trade. And so the United States would be expected to do that, just like other countries bid for Ukrainian food products, and they would get those. It's really not germane at this point. Nobody has said that Ukraine would be limited into whom it could sell its rare earths. So Mr. Lindsey Graham is just confused. I'm trying to be polite here. Is confused. He can get access. You don't need to have a war to get access, and you don't need to persist in the war to get access. He just doesn't understand what the hell is going on, and once again embarrasses himself for those people who do. And I'm sure he's counting on those people being few and far between so that he can get the headline that makes it look somehow plausible for him to be supporting Mr. Trump now that he's figured out that his career depends on it. He's made that mistake twice before, being critical and then having to retract. So now he's avoiding that mistake for a third time. It's only a shame that it took him the repeated experience that touching a hot stove burns your finger.
For the last few months, Richard and I both have been putting that issue in a broader perspective. We've used the Cold War, the fight against Russia, the fight against China, the military Cold War all over the world as being against American economic interests. And we've discussed, how do we have a materialist approach to history, saying that countries are going to act in their own self-interest when it seems to us that the United States is visibly not doing that? And how do we explain Europe's behavior? How can Germany and Europe, which is being devastated by the war in Ukraine and all of the sanctions, and how can all of these other countries somehow be backing this self-destructive American policy and say, well, we can fit that into the materialist approach to history by saying, well, it really is in America's self-interest. Well, all of a sudden, here comes Lindsey Graham and seems to say, well, very simple. The war is in our self-interest. But I think this is nutty for a number of reasons. I mean, on the surface of it, I can see that what Graham and the Republicans are pushing Mr. Trump to do is saying, well, I told you I was going to end the war in one day, and here's how I'm going to do it. We'll give Russia everything that it wants politically. We'll let it denazify Ukraine. We'll sell out Zelensky. We'll let it disarm it and protect itself. Give Russia politically what President Putin has outlined that he wants. And all we want is the natural resources that Lindsey Graham has just enumerated. We want the black soil that's so fertile and the right to sell its agricultural products abroad. We want the metals, the rare earths, which are very difficult, very dirty to mine, and probably are going to pollute all of that nice black soil. And there are two problems with this. Number one, what Ukraine used to be isn't what Ukraine is now, because what Ukraine is now is largely Russia, the Luhansk and Donetsk, and probably Russia is going to take all of the seacoast right over to Odessa, and it may go now further west all the way to the Dnieper River. Well, if that's the case, where are the natural resources? Where is the productive strength of Ukraine for the last 100 years? It's all in the east, in what is now part of Russia. So it's very unlikely that the Russian parts that are going to somehow let American companies come in, mine everything, leaving Russia with nothing. They'll say, we don't make any profits. It's all expensed. It's all interest charges and cost of doing business and managerial fees. So we'll just take all the raw materials and you can do politically whatever you want in the background. Well, obviously that Russia is going to want control of these natural resources itself. It's not going to give them away. In fact, it wants these natural resources and agriculture to help rebuild the destruction of the civilian economies in Luhansk and Donetsk and all the way to Odessa. What is going to be left is a shell of Ukraine is going to be the western part, the old Galicia part, Lvov, and that part. Maybe it'll go all the way up to Kiev, maybe not even that far. So I think that what is left of Ukraine to talk about is not going to be exactly what the Republicans are dreaming about. And I can just imagine the first day of a conversation between Putin and Trump, if Putin really is willing to accept the call. And Trump will say, well, I have a way to discuss the end of the war. And Putin will say, well, wait a minute, the war is still going on. You don't discuss a peace treaty. You don't discuss the end of the war until the war is finished. We're marching through Ukraine to the west. We're not going to stop. The Ukrainian army is destroyed. There's no resistance. Their army is running away. They're defecting. They're trying to escape to foreign countries. We'll be glad to discuss this once the fighting is over. That's when you discuss the peace treaty. And we'll talk to you in a few months. That's what I see.